hold on tight, because you're about to meet one of the most astonishing and yet barely known people in the paranormal field. A Church of England vicar who felt called to become an exorcist. He traveled the world, particularly in the 1970s, to confront not only demonically possessed people, but what he believed were demonically possessed places. It's an intriguing concept which we will explore. So get ready for a series of frightening encounters from devils, possessed animals, and vampires to the mysteries of Loch Ness and the Bermuda Triangle. This vicar's extraordinary adventures will leave you on the edge of your seat. I've spent the last year researching this man, tracking down new information about his life, interviewing people who knew him. That was for a recent cover article in the much-loved paranormal magazine, The 14 Times. But now it is time for you to know a supernatural life story that I cannot believe is not better known. I'm Peter Laws, inviting you into the fog to join one man's global battle against the forces of darkness. Meet the Reverend Donald Omand and the astonishing life story of the world's wildest exorcist. The British newspaper, the Daily Sport, ran an article on me once. They sent me a mock-up before it went to press, and I had a few notes of crucial feedback. Firstly, the headline said, "Possessed by demons, we all have a fear of that happening to us." And I thought, do we? I don't know many people whose biggest worry is getting possessed. And so I suggested changing that. But it was the other part that really got my goat. No, not the terrible photograph of me, but rather the bit where it said exclusive interview with one of the UK's leading exorcists. Yes, I was ordained as a church minister at the time, but I'm no exorcist, never mind the leading one in the country. I'd only delivered a talk on exorcism at the London premiere of a horror film called The Vatican Tapes, and so they assumed I was a real-life devil hunter. And yet, even if I had been an exorcist, I'd have to go to extremely dramatic and epic lengths to beat the man you're going to meet tonight. A vicar with a soft voice and piercing blue eyes who is rarely discussed, and yet his life is rammed with some of the craziest, most spectacular exorcisms you'll ever hear. Donald Omand was born in the city of Perth, Scotland in 1903. His interests and talents in the supernatural sprang from his family. His father, marked as Donald Elder in the 1911 census, was a Presbyterian church minister from Edinburgh, though his family originated from the Orkney Islands. That's a group of more than 70 islands, only 20 of which are inhabited. This mysterious, brooding area of Scotland is a tangled web of Norse, Scottish, and Celtic folklore, and Donald loved to hear those spooky stories growing up, usually from his grandfather, who was also a Presbyterian minister, though a stern and bigoted one. Yet it was Donald's mother who really set the course for his paranormal life. Margaret Omand hailed from the West Highlands and had a form of psychic awareness that Donald called the sight. It came as vivid preternatural pictures in her mind. Donald was a strong believer that in the past, all human beings had the sight, and yet civilization has gradually caused this fairness to dwindle and disappear, although a few outliers still had it, and his mother, he said, was one of them. Donald witnessed this firsthand in 1914 after they had moved to Darlington in the northeast. A woman called Mrs. Scott came to visit his family home, and the two women were happily chatting about general topics until Donald's mother broke into a sudden weird hysteria. She shouted, "Ray is coming down in flames, he's in flames," and then fell to the floor in a faint. Mrs. Scott looked on at this in a cold dread because at the time her son Ray was serving in the Royal Flying Corps. Later, Mrs. Scott got word that Ray had indeed been shot down on the very day of the outburst. This second sight struck again, only this time after Donald almost drowned. He was swimming in a lake with his brother John when he overestimated the depth. Gasping for breath and losing strength, John managed to drag his little brother onto the riverbank. He pressed the waters out of his lungs, and thankfully the boy was okay, but John was terrified that their dad was going to ban them from lake swimming, and so he instructed Donald, "You have to keep this accident a secret." When they arrived home, their dad wasn't there, because he'd already left the house in a frantic panic to find them. You see, earlier Donald's mother had drained of color and started screaming, "My lad is drowning, my lad is drowning." Incidents like this convinced Donald that he was related to a woman with a genuine supernatural gift. Well, as Donald grew into adulthood, a sense of calling grew. He wanted to follow his father and grandfather into church ministry, yet his dad wasn't so keen. Donald Elder thought the lad needed a taste of real life first. I have known countless ministerial candidates to have been told the same thing. If you've grown up in church, you need to get a kind of normal job first to get a feel for the real world. And so Donald found a job right there in Darlington. He worked as a journalist for the Northern Echo newspaper, which led to a foreign correspondence job for a London news agency, and it took him to the continent, which would begin a trend in his life of his ability to wander into the remarkable. You see, in Germany, he bagged an interview with Adolf Hitler, not just once, but 3 times. When Donald became an exorcist later in life, he was asked, of course, if he could sense evil in the early days of the Fuhrer, and funnily enough, no, he said. I felt I was in the presence of someone who needed help. He was dreadfully unhappy and dreadfully lonely, and he seemed strangely empty, almost as though part of his personality was missing. All this changed when Donald attended the Nuremberg rallies and was struck by the stark contrast in Hitler's persona. The private emptiness had been filled with another, more forceful character entirely, and he was occupied by something much more powerful than himself. Certainly it wasn't the pathetic creature I had interviewed. As Donald watched the fiery rhetoric from a man becoming the world's defining evil, he believed he was seeing a human being being taken over by an external, malevolent invader. You might almost say, possessed. Donald had wondered if he might have inherited his mother's supernatural gifts. Growing up, his family had a maidservant from the Isle of Skye called Maggie, who encouraged Donald to nurture his abilities. And yet it was only at college that he began to fully exercise this inherited power. The revelation came when a fellow student came to Donald. He was desperately upset and confided that one of the college professors was abusing him. This teacher had a reputation on campus for being what Donald described as a pervert. Donald encouraged his friend to resist the predator, but he was doubtful whether that was actually possible. But then, one day, he happened to walk into a study where he stumbled across the abusive professor leering over his friend. He immediately felt a sense of sadness and tension in the air and instantly knew what must be happening. Furious at the interruption, the professor glared at Donald and viciously snapped, "Go away!" There are moments in our lives that define us, and this was Donald's. The glaring professor was a fearsome figure in the college, so to stand up to him was no easy task. Donald would later say he didn't fully know what exactly came over him. He just opened his mouth and heard himself saying these words to the tutor. He said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." To say such things to a feared and respected member of the faculty was the very epitome of insult and insubordination, and yet the response was remarkable. To my amazement, this man just seemed to crumple up. He slunk out of the study and showed no more interest in corrupting my friend. Donald couldn't get this incident out of his head. Not only had he sensed evil in the study that day, but his words had somehow shown authority over it. He knew full well that in the New Testament, Jesus had given the disciples the power of exorcism. Might he have been granted such a gift too? He decided not to rush into anything. He would read into the subject extensively while he gained his PhD in comparative religion and religious philosophy. And that study would lead him to lecture on the topic in Berlin, which is when he received confirmation of his true calling as an exorcist. And the revelation came from a totally unexpected source. The circus. While lecturing in religious philosophy, Donald was hired by a prestigious German film studio called UFA. They had made Fritz Lang's Metropolis and F.W. Murnau's Faust, and now they took on Donald as a consultant for a biblical epic. And yet when he turned up at the studio, the lot was flooded with circus folk from across the globe. They were gathered to make a circus film. I venture a guess it was the film Circus of Life from 1927. When the circus performers saw his clerical collar, they were thrilled. A constant life on the road meant no solid connections with local churches. And yet they badly needed a vicar for weddings, baptisms, annual blessings over circus animals. Yes, apparently that's a thing. He sympathized with their plight, and so when lecturing in southern Germany, he learned of a circus visiting the town. And eager to help them with their religious needs, he popped in. And as he wandered through caravans and tents, he expected the usual requests for christenings and blessings, until someone came to him with a gaunt and worried expression. Donald asked what was wrong, and what they told him would lead him to his first exorcism. There was a problem with one of the performers. The strongman had always been a kind and gentle soul until recently. His personality had now changed for the darker. And it started after the circus visited a small town earlier on the trail. The strongman, being very religious, had visited the local church to pray. And yet when he stepped onto the church porch, he claimed to have seen a group of people hunching over another man. He stepped closer and was shocked when the man in the center turned to reveal what Omand's biography describes as the most evil face he had ever seen. Frightened by this malevolent glare, the strongman rushed into the church to kneel and to desperately pray, yet for the first time in his life he couldn't gather the words. Worried, he knew he had to leave the church immediately, but that meant passing the odd group on the way out. He hurried up the aisle and went to leave, but this time he saw the group leader starting to laugh. And to the strongman's horror, he saw the man making the motions of the Holy Eucharist, only backwards. Terror struck, and the strongman scrambled out of the porch, convinced he had just stumbled onto a black mass. The man behind just erupted into the laughter of Satan. While back at the circus, the strongman confided in the ringmaster, and yet as he told his story, his face was beginning to change. As the night went on, other performers began to worry too. This ordinary, gentle strongman was marching around, shouting, swearing, and even started kicking the young children of the circus families. They begged, therefore, the visiting padre to go and speak to him. So Donald agreed, but he was told that the strongman would soon be performing in the big top. His possession hadn't affected his stage commitments, it seems. Donald and the ringmaster headed to the top to wait for the interval, and the trapeze artists were just finishing off. And below, he saw a large metal cage being erected. And when the acrobats were done, it was time for the animal act. And into the cage padded leopards, tigers, and lions, all to the amazed delight of the small-town crowd. The circus trainer began his usual performance tricks until a figure suddenly emerged from backstage. It was the strongman, stomping up to the cage, and he grabbed the bars from the outside with both hands. The ringmaster was furious at this interruption. Not only was it potentially going to mess up the act, but what he was doing was incredibly dangerous. It would distract the animals, and yet the strongman kept on shaking this cage, staring at these beasts inside. 3 of the crew carefully stepped up to remove him, but before they reached him, he slid down the bars and fainted onto the sawdust floor. If they thought it was over, they were very wrong, because at that exact moment, the trainer's favorite animal, a lion, leapt down from the pedestal. Moments ago, it had been quietly sitting, but now it rushed at the trainer and clawed at him and bit him and dragged his panicked body around the inside of that cage. The horrified crowd screamed in terror. Donald was in shock too, but not so much that he didn't notice something odd. The other animals in the tent did not join in the attack. They sat quietly. But it was the lion and lioness who the man had been staring at. It was only those ones that were tearing the trainer into wet ribbons. The ringmaster was convinced the evil in the church had been transmitted to the strongman and had now been transmitted to the lions, just as the demons of Legion had entered the pigs in the New Testament. The ringmaster begged Donald to get into the cage and cast these demons out for good. Well, Donald was willing to admit he was frightened, but he'd been studying exorcism by now, so he knew the rituals and the prayers. And granted, he hadn't expected such a lethal scenario in which to try it, but nobody else could help. And by now the audience had been herded out of the tent, and attendants had managed to drag the ruined body from the cage. The strongman was carried back to his trailer, where a doctor pronounced that he had not fainted earlier, but he was actually in a deep sleep. Sweating with fear, Donald was guided to the cage as the 2 lions leapt back up on their pedestals. They watched him approach. I'm not sure why he couldn't have just done the exorcism through the bars, but the assistant trainer creaked the cage door open and Donald walked inside on trembling legs. And as soon as he entered, fear vanished from him and he was filled with a sense of surprising safety and peace. He raised his hand and recited the exorcism prayers, first in Latin and then in English. And eventually the snarling, narrow-eyed beasts seemed to settle. And then they leapt down from their plinths and padded softly and placidly into the caged tunnel. It was over. Donald had performed his first proper exorcism, not on a person, but on a deadly jungle cat. The story was so wild that it spread, and so when Donald began a lecture tour in the USA, he noticed the halls were starting to heave with people wanting to meet the circus exorcist. Well, when the war was over, Donald moved home to England. His wife was unwell, and so they wanted to be near her family. And he was eventually ordained as a Free Church minister in 1937. Later, he joined the Anglican ministry and worked as a parish priest from 1954 until 1971. Yet during that time and beyond, the forces of darkness would summon him to all corners of the globe. When he was a boy, Donald and his family holidayed in a place called Sand's End, which is just 3 miles up the coast from Whitby. During that trip, they visited a bare and desolate beach a further 3 miles up the coast, and that was called Kettleness. When the young Donald strolled along the shores of Kettleness, he felt himself recoil. He had the distinct impression that this stretch of sand was teeming with demonic entities. Why? He had no idea. He just had this feeling that the spot felt laden with corruption. Well, years later, a relative of his mother, a Scots-Canadian soldier called Bill Dunlop, handed Donald a novel to try. It was Bram Stoker's brilliant novel, Dracula. The then 14-year-old Donald was gripped, but that same shiver came back when he saw that Stoker had mentioned Kettleness by name 5 times. What's more, Dracula had appeared as a black dog, and Donald learned that Kettleness had a legend of a great spectral hound. He closed Stoker's book as a massive fan of the novel, but also the book's themes and location haunted him. So imagine his fright when, as an adult, he received an eerie letter at his vicarage. It was the early 1950s, just before he was received into the Anglican Church, and he was serving as the minister of Beaconsfield Free Methodist. The letter dropped softly on the hallway carpet and was from a schoolmaster who was greatly distressed. He said he had been on holiday with 2 friends when all 3 of them had seen a vast and spectral black hound appear, so large it could not have been natural. The men had encountered this evil presence near Whitby, the letter said, on a beach called Kettleness. That same decades-old dread returned, and fearing for the schoolmaster, Donald immediately replied with a telegram he was ready to help. He hopped straight on a train from King's Cross to Scarborough Station, where the schoolmaster was waiting. The 2 men travelled by car to Sand's End, where Donald booked into a small hotel. And then with a bottle of holy water in hand, the vicar and the teacher drove the coastal roads to the beach, whose dark atmosphere was enough to strike him and Bram Stoker as powerful. Now in his 50s, Donald once more set eyes on the rocky shore. He was surrounded by looming fossilized cliffs and a waterfall. It looked a little different, but one thing remained identical: the aroma of corruption. It was night when the 2 men walked the shore, and Donald was about to make a Dracula joke to lighten the mood when the schoolmaster grabbed his arm. Donald followed his gaze, and there it was, brooding on the shore, an enormous black hound. This, Donald would later say, was not a physical cryptid, but a spectral creature, visible only to those who have the gift. The schoolmaster clearly had this sight because he screamed and ran. Donald stood his ground even as this manifestation pounded across the sand towards him. He popped the cork of his holy water and commanded the demon to leave in the name of Christ. And when the holy water hit the apparition, it vanished. But not only that, the entire beach suddenly seemed to lose its atmosphere of death and dread. So thrilled that the ordeal was over, Donald hurried back to the car, but was shocked to see the schoolmaster had gone out of his mind with fright. Donald remarked how he thought he and the schoolmaster might die on the ride home, so erratic was his host's driving. He was supposed to drop Donald off at the hotel, but he was a total wreck. So the landlord kindly got out of bed to provide a last-minute room for the shaken teacher. And the schoolmaster would never truly escape that night. After he returned to the Midlands, he had a complete nervous breakdown and was eventually admitted to a mental hospital. He died there in his early 60s. Perhaps Donald thought this incident would be the closest experience he would get to a real-life Dracula. If he thought that, though, he was wrong. When Donald did his American lecture tour early in his exorcism career, he had been approached by two medical men in Chicago. They introduced themselves as members of the OIPD, Organization of Inquiry into Psychical Disorder, which had been founded in Vienna the previous year. The group investigated cases where irrational human behavior could not be explained by standard psychiatry. Intrigued by the concept of exorcism, they invited Donald to join their society. Membership was only by election. He did, and some of the wildest cases were to come from this connection. And it was at one of their meetings that he met a Swedish psychiatrist with a truly shocking claim. The doctor said he had a 24-year-old patient held in a private clinic who fully believed he was a vampire. And not just in theory either, in the sense that he genuinely thirsted for blood. The condition came to light 7 years earlier when the then 17-year-old boy was at boarding school. One night, he had crept into his boarding school dormitory and crawled up to one of the sleeping boys, and leaning in, he had clamped his teeth into the boy's throat and sucked as hard as he could to drink him in. Naturally, the kid woke up screaming, and the other kids in the dormitory woke to this racket and could barely believe what they were seeing. In a gang, they dragged the vampire off. The boys had developed a code of silence with misbehavior, however, and so while they made it very clear to the boy that this act was unacceptable, they kept it quiet from the teachers until 8 weeks later, when the teenage vampire struck again. It happened at 4 a.m. this time, and the boy bit his teeth down so hard that he tore a deep and ragged gash in the fellow pupil's throat. This time, the wound was so serious that it was impossible to cover up. Panicked, they raised the alarm, and the horrified teachers rushed the victim to the hospital, and the boy responsible was immediately committed to a psychiatric clinic. 3 weeks later, he tried to bite the neck of a male nurse. The boy's wealthy parents were disgusted. They couldn't bear to see him, so they had him transferred to an isolated private hospital amongst the dense woodlands of Scandinavia. They hoped their money might fund him some kind of cure. His attacks on male staff continued. He drew blood with his teeth on 2 further occasions. As the psychiatrist presented this dramatic case to Donald and the OIPD, he admitted that as a doctor he was skeptical of the concept of vampirism, but he was noticing a worrying detail. He said the staff the boy had bitten were confiding in him that they were developing a growing and morbid fascination with blood. After a robust discussion of this case, Donald argued that this case was beyond psychology and that the boy required an exorcism. Open to the exploration of such a theory, they all unanimously agreed to send Donald to Scandinavia. He arrived at the clinic during nightfall, along with 2 doctors from the OIPD. The following day at 10 a.m., Donald was taken to meet the vampire, escorted by the psychiatrist, a second doctor, and 2 male nurses that were taking no chances. They found the patient relaxing in an armchair, just idly flicking through a German magazine. Seeing his visitors, the man set down the magazine and stood up to greet him. They seemed courteous and friendly, though Donald noticed his palm was unusually clammy. The patient asked to spend some time with Donald, but the staff refused at first. Donald convinced them to give them some space, but to leave the door ajar. And they did. And so, now that they were alone, the vampire calmly asked Donald to come closer so he might whisper something into his ear. But at that point, his face contorted into that of a wild beast. Before Donald knew it, he felt sharp fingernails raking across his face, and it tore through his lip with a severe laceration. Lips are filled with so much blood, and now Donald's lower mouth was drenched in it. And seeing all of that blood, this greedy patient sprang forward, his tongue lolling towards Donald's wet chin. Donald also noticed a hideous stench coming from the patient. Well, thankfully, the patient never reached him because the two male nurses burst in and dragged him off, and Donald was hurried to the infirmary where he had his lip fixed up. But rather than be shaken, the vicar was elated. The smell that hit him was the same noxious odor that he had experienced at Kettleness. For him, this was the proof he was seeking that this issue was demonic, which meant he believed he could fix it. They didn't rush into an exorcism, however. Instead, Donald and the doctors devised a series of bizarre tests. For example, they put a mirror in front of the young man to see if it cast a reflection. Some of the other staff laughed at this, especially when he cast a reflection. He was also unfazed by holy water. Indeed, the patient covered his hands and rubbed the water on his face, saying, "This is very soothing." Donald even brought in animal blood from the kitchens and human blood, which was provided by 4 volunteers, and he served this blood in coffee cups as a blind taste test. The young man seemed excited when Donald brought him a cup of blood, but when he lifted it to his lips, he paused. A long moment passed before he walked to the sink and poured the rest of the blood away. The second blood cup was offered, and this time, he had no control. The man seized it and guzzled the contents before an appalled audience. The rejected cup was animal blood. The second cup was human. When the elaborate vampire tests were complete, Donald was convinced that an exorcism was required. It happened with 3 witnesses. He placed some blessed rock salt and water on a table in the center of the room, and when they started the ritual, the patient didn't react. He just watched this strange priest calling out prayers and readings, and yet sometime into the ritual, Donald said the words, "Strike terror, O Lord, into the wild beast rooting up thy vine." And it was when he said that all hell broke loose. The vampire, quiet up until this point, suddenly lunged at Donald with a bestial ferocity. He didn't want to drink Donald's blood anymore. He wanted to murder him there and then. The nurses grabbed him and restrained him in a chair, and after some medication was given, Donald completed the ritual. Now, whether this was all a psychological placebo or a genuine spiritual breakthrough is up to you to decide, but the patient seemed cured after that. He was eventually allowed to leave, and he moved to an isolated part of South Norway with his parents. 3 months later, the clinic reported all as well. Donald was called in on other cases of vampirism, including a patient who later discovered that he was a direct descendant of Countess Elizabeth Bathory, the notorious royal who drank and bathed in human blood. Donald probed deeper into this case and discovered a spine-tingling connection. The parents of this young vampire had toured England by car a few months after they were married, and they'd enjoyed their time in England, other than one stretch of coastline, which they said left them feeling both depressed. Donald probed them on the name. Oh, they said. They called that place, Kettleness. All these incidents of vampirism and black phantom hounds threaded a thought in Donald's mind. He knew that people could become possessed, but what about places? Kettleness had, in his opinion, been occupied by an evil force with the power to influence, corrupt, and even control others. And so Donald began to wonder if his exorcist calling was broader than he had originally imagined. What happens if he was called not only to exorcise people, but places? Mention an exorcism, and people tend to picture a priest casting a demon out of a person, and Donald certainly did plenty of those. For example, like the case of a father who returned from the Middle East to face a shocking reaction from his 14-year-old daughter. The normally placid teen was triggered by his arrival, and she screamed and wailed, crawling around like that girl in The Exorcist, said the Belfast News. Donald thought it was obvious that she was possessed by a demon brought back from this Middle East trip. Or maybe she was simply scared of her dad. Whatever the case, the poor girl was in this dreadful, savage condition for the next 4 years. When Donald met her, she was 18 and living with her weary parents in a remote house in Scotland. They'd hidden her from the locals, and so they barely even knew she existed until the postman heard terrifying screams and crying from the home. When Donald was called, he found her crawling on all fours in her room, just like an animal. She was grunting, snarling, and covered in her own excrement. You'd think social services would drag the parents in, but Donald said he saw the girl's eyes glowing red, and so an exorcism began. 2.5 hours later, the daughter came to as if waking from a dream, and she was her old self again, and assumed she was still 14, until she looked in the mirror and saw an adult staring back, ravaged with the suffering of the 4 long years that she had no memory of. Yet, only a third of Donald's exorcisms involved people. The rest were connected to places or sites that he believed, like Kettleness, had evil power. Accident black spots were an area of concern for him, and he would zero in on specific strips of road where repeated car crashes occurred. Donald first considered the idea of demonically engineered accidents when he met an Austrian hospital consultant, and the doctor claimed that their casualty ward had seen a sudden upturn in road accidents. The disturbing part was that the motorists were reporting that they felt compelled to crash their cars. With the help of a surgeon, physician, and a police chief, Donald interviewed 1,000 accident victims and heard many frightening stories about why they crashed. They had usually been driving along quite happily when they reached a specific part of the road, and it was here that they were suddenly overcome with the insane yet impossible to resist urge to jerk the steering wheel, and then they would slam the car into oncoming traffic. A student nurse passed on one particularly freaky incident to Donald. A car crash victim said that he was driving along in a country lane when he saw a sports car heading towards him on the other side of the road. He felt an impulse to plow into the other vehicle. But he said he was a devout Catholic, so he prayed that this dangerous influence would leave him, and it did almost immediately. However, to his horror, he saw the oncoming sports car suddenly mirror what he had almost done himself. That car suddenly swerved across the road, and the two cars smashed into one another head-on. Whatever roamed that road was determined to see destruction by any means. Donald visited hundreds of black spots to carry out exorcisms. According to his biographies, this was sometimes at the secret request of local hospital staff. The BBC made a documentary about his road exorcisms, including one ritual he carried out en route between Charmouth and Morecambe Lake in Dorset. Mark Alexander's biography claimed that there had been 17 accidents in the 6 months before the exorcism, and then none the following 6 months. Impressed with the Donald effect, racehorse owner Aga Khan once asked Donald, "You don't think you could ever do anything about that terrible corner at Epsom Racecourse, do you?" I was able to find evidence, however, of his claims being questioned by others. I found a newspaper article about a so-called cursed stretch of road, the A30 at Iron Bridge near Honiton in Devon. Sister Daphne Reeves of Honiton Hospital had claimed that the road had 7 fatal crashes in the year before the exorcism and none after. The article argued that there actually had only been 1 death before the exorcism ritual and 3 serious accidents after. Well, his focus on demonically infested locations would lead him to some of his most eyebrow-raising escapades. In September 1967, Donald was taking a break from casting out demons. He was caravanning on the shores of Loch Long in Rossshire. Yet the Fortean world was always close at hand. While strolling along the water's edge, he noticed the surface of the loch suddenly disturbed, and amazed he claimed to see 2 humps emerge from the foam. Not content with just one sea monster sighting, he had another in June 1968. This time he was in the company of Captain Jan Anderson, who had taken him out to a mysterious waterway in Norway known as Trollfjord, or the Fjord of the Trolls. As the ship cut through the lake, both men witnessed 2 humps slide up into view. Donald was scared, understandably so. Last time he was on the shore, now he was on the water itself. That's a bit more scary. Yet the captain was surprisingly relaxed. He admitted that he had seen this before, and assured Donald that it would never hurt them. "They never do," he said. And sure enough, the creature veered off to the starboard side, and they both watched it sink and vanish. Donald was excited and said, "Let's follow it." But the captain refused, and when quizzed why, his answer was confusing. He said to Donald, "That creature is evil." Now, Donald frowned at this. Why on earth should a hidden, unknown animal be classed as evil? Indeed, this was surely just a previously undiscovered biological marvel. And yet the captain's theory seemed to evoke memories of the great black hound on Kettleness beach. You see, Anderson went on saying that he doubted it even was a physical creature at all, but that it was some sort of manifestation, something akin to the serpent tempter from the book of Genesis. This theory gained more traction in 1972 when Donald attended the year's OIPD conference. A Scandinavian neurologist shared his concerns about the sightings of a legendary creature on Lake Storjon. He wasn't so much bothered about whether the beast existed or not, illusion or not. He was more concerned with the effect the sightings were having on the witnesses. You see, he said that their lives were starting to fall apart soon after seeing this creature, with broken homes or immoral acts, they said. He asked Donald if an exorcism might be required even at a place like that. Now, this prompted much debate, of course. How would one exorcise an enormous body of water with a vast unknown creature in it? They decided that Donald should test the theory out. Yet rather than ship him out to Scandinavia just yet, they suggested he try it on a beastie closer to home, which is why Donald Omand headed north to carry out an exorcism on Loch Ness. Donald believed that all of these sightings of the Loch Ness monster may have actually been people witnessing the spectre of an ancient dragon, a theory explored in F.W. Holliday's The Dragon and the Disc. He also speculated that Nessie's malign spiritual influence had sparked a wave of drinking, drugs, broken marriages, and even black magic in the locals. Aleister Crowley did have his home by the loch in Boleskine House. Did the notorious occultist choose that location for the views and legends, or was the great beast deliberately summoned there by an inherently evil spectral beastie on the lake? Well, Loch Ness is colossal. It covers an area of 56.4 kilometers squared with a murky depth of 230 meters. So casting a demon out of such a vast body would be no mean feat. To plan the ritual, Donald brought in a Benedictine monk from Buckinghamshire called Dom Robert Petitpierre. The two men pored over a large-scale map of the loch and came up with a novel approach. They charted out a crucifix shape across the water, and the plan was to carry out an exorcism at the 4 external points of the cross located on the shore, followed by one final exorcism from the boat bobbing on the surface where the crossbeams intersected. And so in June 1973, a 71-year-old Donald arrived in Drumnadrochit, just by Loch Ness. With him was a photographer called Steve Roberts, and a group was there to meet him, including Wing Commander Basil Carey and his wife Winifred, plus Dragon and the Disc author F.W. Holliday. The party of 5 were blessed with holy water, and then they set off in 2 cars to begin the multi-site ritual. The BBC later covered the event for their nationwide program, recreating the journey for the cameras. Holliday wrote an account of the day and remarked on the growing sense of tension that came the closer they got to the final rite on the water. When the rituals were finally complete, Donald almost collapsed. He had to be physically carried back to his caravan afterwards. This personal energy drain was proof to him that the exorcism had worked, though he was eager to point out later that he had only removed the evil from Nessie. The beast might still be spotted in the years ahead, just without the moral corruption in its wake. Well, the BBC put Donald's theory to the locals, including a man who was interviewed standing at his garden gate. The presenter asked him if he believed Nessie was an evil spirit driving all the locals to drink. He burst out laughing and said, "We don't need a monster to do that." A few days after the loch exorcism, Donald was bitten by a dog in Devon. The bandage on his hand prompted locals to think Nessie had bitten him during his exorcism trip. The Loch Ness purging was deemed a success, and so Donald went on to exorcise Lake Storjon in Sweden, the case that had prompted all of this. It was a much bigger lake than Loch Ness, but after the ritual, Donald was confident of success. and afterwards he liaised with the physician who first brought the case to the OIPD, and the doctor had been tracking incidents of suicide, mental illness, and marital breakdown, and claimed that these had all dramatically decreased after the exorcism. However, Donald was not content with stopping with even this vast body of water, because towards the end of his life he went even bigger with his most ambitious exorcism yet. In January 1978, Donald decided to exorcise that most notorious paranormal hotspot, the Bermuda Triangle. Theories about what causes the triangle's disappearances include UFOs, portals, sea monsters, time funnels, and of course, natural phenomena. Donald had a different take. It came to him during an American lecture tour in the 1950s. While in Miami, he was invited on a boat trip by a sailor called Nick Sinclair. The boat, called Dainty Dinah, set out in perfect weather, and yet once the land had vanished from view, a fierce storm kicked in. They waited as the storm battered the boat, and Nick tried to reassure Donald that such stark weather changes were not unusual at the edge of the Bermuda Triangle. This was the first time Donald had ever heard of that phrase, and he knew nothing of the mysteries reported there. Yet above the wind and quaking waves, the priest was sure he could hear something. He could hear the sound of hundreds of voices crying out in lament. His second sight immediately told him that these were the voices of the dead enslaved people who had been abducted from Africa and brought to the colonies of America. Some of them were thrown overboard and perished in these very waters. He believed he was hearing the mournful cries of those people. Back on land, Donald learned more of the triangle and wondered if the phenomena there was somehow linked to the hideous and echoed sins of the slave trade. He discussed his theory with various people, including, he claimed, Martin Luther King, and Donald claimed that King agreed with his theory that the enslaved dead may have somehow haunted that stretch of water. Donald researched the triangle and found that others had heard this strange moaning too. Perhaps exorcising the evil from these waters could put these poor souls to rest. Well, Donald, along with an English medical doctor called Terry Glanville, returned to the triangle in January 1978. Together, they hopped on mopeds and searched Bermuda for the right place to perform the ritual, and they found it in Horseshoe Bay. The plan was to exorcise the 3 points of the triangle in Bermuda, and then in Miami, and then in Puerto Rico. He also arranged for a special prayer service to take place in Ghana, Nigeria, and Zambia, as well as Bristol and Liverpool in the UK, where some of the slave traders had their home ports. The ritual at Horseshoe Bay took 2 hours and concluded with Donald wading into the waters in his clerical robes to complete the rite. 12 days later, on the 28th of January, one of the most striking incidents to ever happen in the Triangle took place. A Boeing 727 from Miami to Newark lost all 3 engines in the area. The crew were baffled as to how this could have happened. They didn't have long to theorize as the plane dropped through the air, plunging 7,000 feet. And they were facing certain death in the waters and seemed destined to become another victim of the Devil's Triangle, until the engines suddenly roared back into life, and the amazed pilots were able to avoid the sea and reach a safe altitude once more. Did Donald's exorcism 12 days before break the power of the Bermuda Triangle's curse? Well, he and his biographer certainly thought so. To cover all of the events in the dramatic life of Reverend Donald Omand would take a book. So if you want to hear of his tangles with sea madness and cursed Chinese idols and more, you need to consult elsewhere. No wonder that in 1975, the Belfast News called him one of the most widely travelled clerics in the world and one of Britain's top exorcists. Donald's mission was to see medical science and the church working together to solve human suffering. He told the Belfast News that doctors should be able to call on exorcists in any case, just as they would consult an ear, nose, or throat specialist. He even kept blessing circuses all the way up to his late 60s. I found a Daily Mirror article from 1970 picturing him inside a lion's cage doing a ritual there. Now, cynics might call his career something of a cash grab, but he never did take payment for work beyond his parish duties. He told a newspaper that the day he ever made money out of his supernatural gifts, those gifts would dry up. Mark Alexander's biography, complete with a personal recommendation by the then Bishop of Hertford, showcases an earnest man eager to do good and thoroughly convinced of the supernatural. Colin Wilson wrote the foreword and agreed with Donald's belief in the paranormal realm, though he disagreed with the Christianized lens through which it was presented. However, the books and articles on Donald do seem to omit some of the less flattering details that I've uncovered. For example, my deep dive into his history uncovered a Daily Mirror news report from June 22nd, 1965, where Donald was barred from 3 pubs in his home village because of drunkenness. He was 57 at the time and was serving as the vicar in Chideock near Bridport, Dorset. The Mirror contacted him at the vicarage and asked him why Mr. Jim Hunt from the Castle Inn had barred him, along with a strong letter of complaint to the parochial church council. Mrs. Dorothy Lowe, the owner of the Clubhouse Hotel over the road, told them, "I will not have Dr. Omand again." It appeared to be a row that got out of hand, and Donald called the claim grossly exaggerated due to a case of illness. A church official told the paper, "I understand the vicar has been advised to seek medical help." I spoke to a local who remembered the incident. He told me that Donald had been harassing the female darts team, though I was unable to confirm that. I must say that I did speak to other people who knew him at the time, and many remembered his animal blessing services with great fondness, though some said that they found his doll exhibition set out in his own home to be a little creepy. But many were complimentary. Some were less so, including one woman who even called him vile. Well, it's no surprise to find that locals have mixed feelings about a village vicar who got into scrapes in the local pubs while also traveling the globe casting out demons. Maybe some parishioners were embarrassed, while others were proud to have a totally out-of-the-box clergy member in their midst. The years of relatively mundane service to the local community is hardly the stuff of newspaper serializations or biographies. But his long career in local church ministry meant he did still find time to do funerals and baptisms and village fetes and run-of-the-mill life of a vicar who just happened to banish sea monsters on his day off. The strain of his busy life did take its toll, however. I found another tiny notice in a newspaper from his early days as a free church minister in the Methodist Church. While taking part in a parade service at Wilton Park, Beaconsfield, he fainted, rallied, and then fainted again the following week. He was rushed to hospital with severe abdominal pain, but recovered nicely with a seaside convalescence. Perhaps on that shore, with time to breathe, he watched the lapping waves and thought of Kettleness and the epic calling on his life. A calling that went far beyond the borders of both his parish and his retirement. His was a life that would exhaust the energy of the rest of us, yet it seemed to stoke him all the way to his death on the 12th of May, 1983. It reminds me of something. I was told once that statistically speaking, vicars or pastors live longer. Indeed, in 1983, fellow British male pensioners died at 71 and a half years, yet Donald was already clocking up an entire bonus decade by then. Whether priests are naturally healthier or spiritually protected is anyone's guess, but my money is on the notion that vicars never really retire. Even when they hand in their cross and badge after their final church placement, they're still seen as relevant. They're a bit like ex-presidents or elder politicians. It's one of the few jobs where even elderly retirees are still held in a kind of reverence when they enter or are wheeled into a room. I've seen it. They still feel needed and relevant to many. Perhaps Donald needed to be needed. Or maybe he was just carrying out his genuine calling. A calling that doesn't simply stop at a particular age. When he retired in the early 1970s, he simply skipped the part about settling down. Instead, he ramped up the energy and began a decade of wild, newsworthy adventures. These escapades were said to have set the possessed people's spirits free and made them whole again. Yet ironically, every fresh case seemed to liberate and reaffirm the exorcist himself. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to The World's Wildest Exorcist. Good night.